Hello out there. So it's been a little while since I made a video, maybe a month now, I don't know. Anyway, so I thought I'd get back on the bandwagon with something particularly fun. This is going to be a tutorial on how to connect a Linux system to an Active Directory Windows-based domain. So this will be interesting because it is probably one of the very few videos that I will actually demonstrate more Windows topics than even Linux ones, because the actual act of connecting Linux to a Windows domain is surprisingly easy and should be fairly straightforward. So really what I'm going to do is we're going to focus on this guy for the moment, and I want to basically talk to you a bit about how the network is configured now, because I've changed how things are done a little bit. So basically, this is the router from, if you remember from the previous video, this guy here is basically a router that I created in my NFTables video. It is largely unchanged from what it was then. It's basically just going to take packets from inside my virtual isolated network and send them out, and then take packets from outside the virtual isolated network and send them in, such that basically systems in this virtual isolated network will be able to communicate with the internet and the rest of my network here. And so, sorry, I have a little bit of a cold. Anyway, so what basically this means is that this system here, which is our router client, which sits behind the router, has one network interface. This guy has two network interfaces. So this guy's on an isolated network, and this guy here is also on that isolated network, but it has that second network interface that communicates with the outside world effectively. So basically this system can only communicate through this system here. Now at the moment, this system cannot communicate through this system because I've changed the networking a little bit, such that I have removed the DHCP functionality from my virtual network, such that it will be taken over by my Active Directory domain controller. And that is, well, I'll get to why that is in a moment, but basically the gist of the reason for that is that we require dynamic DNS, which is easier to do if I just use a Windows domain controller, Windows DNS Server, and Windows DHCP Server. Perhaps in a later video, I will demonstrate how to remove that functionality from Windows. Well, I guess more or less make it go dormant, because DNS is kind of a prerequisite to having a domain controller, and it will be installed basically just by the act of creating a domain controller. But you can instead use bind9 and ISC DHCP server, or whatever DHCP service you want to use, and then I can show you how to create a dynamic DNS solution using bind9, which is a Linux-based DNS solution, as well as the Linux-based DHCP solution, which is what I actually use on my main network. But because this is going to be focusing on a Windows domain controller in a Windows world, and joining Linux systems to that, basically I want to show you guys what you may already have in your network if you're already using an Active Directory solution. So we're going to take the approach in this video as if you were coming at it as you had a completely Windows-based network, and now you're adding Linux systems to that network and trying to get them to be treated as a first-class citizen. Now, point of contention here, you do not require some weird third-party central middleware stack thing like Centrify or Quest to do this. You can add those if you want, and I think they add some features like trying to force GPO policy on Linux systems, which is not recommended. Just use Ansible, Puppet, or Chef. They have those things. They're fine. If you really want a GPO type system for Linux computers. But you can optionally use Quest or Centrify if you want. This video is not going to cover those because it's completely unnecessary in my particular opinion. You can join a Linux system to a Windows domain just fine without Centrify or Quest. And yes, Linux will be treated as a first-class citizen, and I'll demonstrate some of the features that you get in so doing. For those of you who don't know what a Windows domain is a type of single sign-on solution for basically managing your users and passwords and computers on a network. So effectively, you can have one user who can log in to, say, a laptop, and then they can go turn around and use their same credentials to log into a desktop. And if you change your password on the desktop, you then use that same changed password on the laptop. effectively meaning that you don't need to manage your password or your account credentials on all these different computers. So if you had a network of 300 machines, you don't have to worry about if a user can log into each individual machine. As long as they have a domain account, they can log into all of them. Now, it is, of course, possible to block people from logging into certain machines, etc., and so forth. And maybe I'll show you a little bit of that later, but that's a little beyond the scope of this video. The intention of this video is to just get you to be able to connect your system to a Windows domain, and that's it. So let's take a look at that. The first thing we're going to do in doing this is we're going to go ahead and this, by the way, is a Server 2019, Windows Server 2019 basic installation with the desktop features enabled. You can install it without that, but for simplicity's sake, I'm going to show it to you with that installed. If you want to do it on a stripped down system, you are more than welcome to. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to use Server Manager here, and we're going to go to Manage, and we're going to go to Add Roles and Features. Now, this video is going to take this from the perspective that you do not currently have a domain controller set up. So if you were thinking of building one, this is how you would do it. Now, I've scaled this up a bit to try to make it easier for people to see the screen because this is all taking place in a virtual machine. So the resolution's a little janky, but it's like that on purpose for the sake of your own visibility. So just note that normally the resolution is a bit better here. And in fact, it's still actually using high resolution. It's just scaled up all the text and everything for you. So basically, we're just going to hit Next. We're going to do a role-based or feature-based installation. Here we're going to do select a server from the server pool. This is the server that I've created. It's a fresh installed Windows. Nothing has been done to it. It isn't even activated yet. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that. Now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to hit I want Active Directory Domain Services. I'm going to add those features, and then I'm going to come down and I'm going to add a DHCP server, and I'm going to continue that, and I'm going to hit DNS Server. Now, technically speaking, you don't even need to hit DNS. If you just install Active Directory Domain Controller, you'll get DNS just by default, but I'll check it there just to, just for crossing the T's and dotting the I's, I guess. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Next. You don't need anything in here. Just take the defaults. You'll have Group Policy Management, .NET Framework, etc. So just take whatever it gives you there, unless you specifically want something else from the list, in which case, your mileage may vary, but to do this particular tutorial, just take the defaults. Hit Next, and then it's going to tell you Active Directory Domain Services Setup. We're going to go ahead and do confirmation, tell it to restart once everything's good. Yes, we want to restart, and then we're going to tell it to install. And now it's going to go through the installation process. I may fast forward the video at some point here. Okay, so having spared you from the pain of watching this install, basically it just got down to the feature installation complete. I'm going to go ahead and close this window here. Normally, I would say you should reboot your computer here to continue, just to cross the T's and dot the I's, whatever. But in this case, I'm actually going to power it all the way down because I actually need to attach another CD-ROM device to this machine because, as you can see here, I don't have a network card. And the reason I don't have a network card is because I'm using the Virtuo driver with it, or the Virtuo network interface within my KVM installation here. So I need to install a quick driver. I'll probably do that bit off camera because it doesn't really impact people, but basically the process I'm going to use is I'm going to mount a CD-ROM, and then I'm going to run the installer from within the CD-ROM drive that's mounted, and that's going to fix my network card. So when I join back up with you guys, we'll have the server completely rebooted, back up and ready to promote to a domain controller, and hopefully this time with a network interface card. Alright, so as you can see, we are back and we have our network interface. However, you can see there's still a triangle here with no network connectivity. So if we go into here, we can see that we have our adapter, change properties. We're going to go in here, we're going to hit properties. We're going to click on, in my case, we're going to set up an Internet Protocol version 4, as I had previously talked about in my prior video. Here in the States, we don't really use IPv6 because we are lamers. So IPv4 it is. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and set up a simple 192.168.101, and we'll go with 10. And basically what I'll reserve IPs 1 through 10 there for us, you know, my domain kind of stuff, whatever. And then we'll do 192.168.101. I think 133 is actually what the router is, but we can check that. Let me pull this off of here just in case we get more information than we want. And that is why I did that. Yes, it is 133 though. So yes, 133 is what we want. And then the DNS server is actually going to be 127.0.0.1. And we're not going to use an alternate in this case, although if you have a second domain controller, you'd probably want that set up as well. Speaking of which, in this case, I'm not going to cover replication and all that. I'm only going to set up one domain controller. It is definitely recommended that you set up a second domain controller and configure replication across, such that if one domain controller is down, the other is up, etc. and so forth. So let's OK that, let's close that, and we should, in this case, now have internet. All right, so now that we've got our network card configured, let's try google.com here. And we should have, yeah, sure, why not? And hopefully, with any luck, this awfully slow server will pull a website for us. Would be nice. Hey, look, there we go. Google.com. Okay, that was terrible. So, word to the wise, don't browse the web on your domain controller. Not because it's slow or anything like that, but simply because it's just really, really stupid. I pulled that up just to test that, and this is a domain controller that I plan to destroy and do not plan to keep. So, please do yourself a big favor and don't use the internet on your domain controller to browse the web. That's just idiotic. Anyway, so now that we have our domain controller set up, we're not... And now that we have our network interface card configured, we're not quite ready to set up our domain just yet. Before we do that, let's go ahead and turn on our DHCP configuration. So let's go to Tools and then down to DHCP, and that will bring up this handy dandy little interface, which we can then expand, and we can go to IPv4, and we can come in here and we can set up a new scope, which we're going to do. And we're going to come in here and we're going to name this example.local. The domain, by the way, that I'm going to use is example.local. That's what I'm going to do. And this can be named anything. It doesn't have to be named example.local. I just went with that because, hey, why not? But you can name it however you prefer. Here you want to set your start address, 192.168.1. Or I'm sorry, not 1, 101.0. And you can end it at 192.168.101.255 if you like. And that'll be the range that this scope distributes. And actually, if you really want to, rather than setting an exclusion, you can set that to 10. And 255 is generally not one that you distribute, so you can go 254 there if you want to save yourself some, you know, weirdness. All right. Subnet mask, you're going to leave that at 255, 255, 255.0. The only reason you would change that is if you wanted to have a smaller range or a larger one. So for instance, if you wanted to do, you know, 101 and instead down here you wanted 104 or something like that, then you could change this to a 0. You can use whatever one you prefer, I guess, whatever your preference is for your specific network. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to stick with a Class C 255.255.255.0 network just to complete the demonstration. So this is IP ranges that you want to exclude. And so what I've actually done on the prior page by starting it at 192.168.101.10, that means that you don't actually need to fill this out because it knows to exclude the numbers 1 through 10. So that is that. And because I didn't actually click add and there's nothing in this box here, it's fine. It's not going to actually add it. This is how long the duration for your leases. That's perfectly fine. You can leave that alone. If you want to change it, you can for whatever reason. But for this demonstration, I'm going to leave it alone. Yes, we want to configure options for our DHCP. So let's add some router. Our router in this case is going to be 192.168.101.133. We're going to go ahead and add that guy. And then we're going to create a This is the DNS. So this is going to tell it to use our server here as a DNS server. Okay, we're not going to use wins, so we can leave that alone. We want to activate the scope. Yes, we're good. So now we're just going to come in here. We've got our scope, and we should be good to go at this point. So yeah, I think that's got it. Doesn't even look like we got to authorize it. We can refresh to make sure everything's running and okay, so it looks like we're good. So what I'll do now is come over here to our router client and reboot him. Oh, actually, you know what? Let's get the DNS setup configured first before we do that. Let's actually take a look at this guy. Come in here and we'll go properties, and then over here we'll go to DNS. Okay, so this is very important. You need to make sure you check this box to dynamically update DNS records for DHCP clients that do not request updates. The reason you need to do that is so that your Linux clients will update their DNS records. Now, DNS is going to be very important for the operation of your Active Directory system. Okay, so if you have problems in Active Directory, 9 out of 10, your problem is DNS. So, for instance, when you try to join the domain, you may get an unauthorized error, which may be the case that your user doesn't have privileges to join the domain, join systems to the domain. And in that case, you need to make him a member of the domain admins group, or however you prefer to go about that. In my case, that's what I'm going to do, just because this is a demonstration and I'm trying to keep it quick. But you may also see that error, and the reason that you get that no permissions error is because the system is not doing a reverse lookup properly on the DNS name for the system, and so it can't properly join. So this will allow your Linux system to have its DNS record updated. So let's go ahead and apply that and OK that. That's one of the very few special considerations you'll need to make for Linux on this system. There's not many. So at this point, we should be able to pull up our DNS, and we should be able to see in here that we have this DNS system here. So we should have a forward lookup and we should have a reverse lookup. So our forward lookup and our reverse lookup is not yet created because we haven't promoted to a new domain controller yet. So we're going to wait to do anything here until we've promoted to a domain controller. So let's go ahead and take care of promoting to a domain controller. So if we click on our little flag guy here, you can see post-deployment configuration setup. We've kind of already done the DHCP configuration, so we really don't need to worry about that. But let's do a promote server to a domain controller real quick, and we should be able to do that. Now in my case, I'm going to add a new forest. You can create, if you have an existing domain and you want to add a domain controller to it, you can do that. If you have an existing domain you want to add to an existing, or a new domain you want to add to an existing forest, you can. But if you're creating your very first domain controller on your network, period, you want to create a new forest. And you're going to create a new root domain name for that. And that's going to be example.local in my case. Now, here's the interesting thing about domain names. You may think of domain names as example.com. You can use that. There's nothing technically preventing you from using that, but if you ever set up a website on your local domain, you're going to have issues with local users being able to resolve the website because the DNS records are going to point to the domain controller and not your web server, unless they're served from the same box, which is very taboo. Don't do that. So there are a couple of ways around this. The first and easiest is probably just to name your internal domain example.local instead of example.com. Now, the other way around this is to use magic that Linux provides and set your system up as a router and have it route packets based on what those packets technically contain. So, for instance, what ports the packets are traversing, should I say? I can have my Linux system basically route packets dynamically to a different system based on the fact that it's traversing port 443. So if it's coming across 443, I know it's web traffic, or at least it should be, so I'm going to send it to the web server. Whereas if it's going to example.com and it's on 53, I know that's DNS. We're going to send that to our domain controller, because that's also our DNS server. So that's sort of the trick that you can use there in order to manipulate that. That trick is outside of the scope of this video. Maybe I'll demonstrate that in a future video, but for now what we're going to use is example.local as our domain name. So we're going to go ahead and create that. It should take just a second here. Now you'll notice that this says Windows Server 2016. This is in fact a Windows Server 2019 system. However, if you look on this list, 2016 is the highest it goes. 2016 is the highest it goes for the domain and the forest functional level. So even if you have a Windows Server 2019 system, your domain from a functional standpoint should be identical to a 2016 system because there are apparently no changes, and thus the functional level did not increment when they added or when they released Windows Server 2019. So we're going to go ahead and set up a global catalog and a domain name server on this guy. We are not going to create a read-only domain controller because this is our first and primary domain controller. Here we're going to create a simple password for our system. So I'm going to use password with a capital P, P-A-S-S-W-R-D, space shift 1 2 3 4. P-A-S-S-W-R-D, space shift 1 2 3 4, and hopefully that will take. It looks like it did. We're going to not worry about the DNS delegation. We actually can't mess with it right now. That's probably because it doesn't have an existing DNS system that it's joining to. So if you are in a situation where you can make use of that and you know what you're doing, please do so. The NetBIOS name should be automatically detected and should basically be our domain name, but in capital letters and possibly without the .local at the end. Let's take a look. There it is, example. So let's do a next. Give it just a minute. And okay, these are our database log and sysvol folders. We're going to leave those at the default. You can change them if you want. I leave them as default. And that is that. Basically, we are good to go. We're just going to hit next, and we're going to let this thing verify. We're probably going to get a couple of warnings, and that'll be okay as long as we don't see any errors. Now, if you do see warnings in your installation, you're going to be moving this thing into production. You may want to look into resolving those warnings, but in my case, I'm not really going to worry about them because this is just a demonstration. So yeah, you can see here it's warning me that a delegation DNS server cannot be created because the authoritative parent zone cannot be found. Basically, we are not using, we're creating a brand new Windows DNS server, so this should be fine in our case. Here, we're using a Windows Server 2019 domain controllers have a default for the security setting named allow cryptography algorithm that prevents weaker cryptography. This is just a warning. I don't think it's really an issue that's going to block anything. Here you can see we have all prerequisites passed successfully. That's what you want to see. As long as you see that, you're probably good to go ahead and install your domain controller. So let's go ahead and click install. We're going to see those warnings again because, you know, reasons. And I'll probably end up stopping the video through this process unless something interesting happens during it so that you don't have to painfully watch it do this if it takes a while. So if you see it jump and it's completely done, that's why. As you can see here, your system may reboot during this process. It didn't exactly warn me that it was going to do that. Maybe that has to do with the checkbox I set up when I configured the domain controller in the beginning. But just be aware that your system may reboot during the process. Alrighty, so as you can see here, we are back in business. Let's go ahead and hit this send keystroke, Control-Alt-Delete. Alright, and so we're back up and running, and I'm actually logged in with my Active Directory domain controller account. One thing you may notice is I don't have network connectivity right now, and the reason that is, as I have discovered, is that we made a little error in our DHCP calculations here. So if you look at our DHCP server, you come down here, if you go to properties, in my particular case anyway, sorry, that's not correct. I need to come down here to the actual scope and go to properties here, and I just adjusted the start range to .11. So what was happening is my server was actually getting the same IP address as the client because the client was catching the first DHCP address, which was .10, and that's also the IP address of the server, so we were getting an IP collision, which was creating problems. So this will resolve that, and then all I have to do is have the other server refresh its IP address, and then we're good to go. Just disable and then enable this, and then we should get proper internet, I hope. So let's try pinging 8.8.8.8. Yes, and we can get out. So we have internet now. Good deal. Okay, so we have internet on this box, and you can see that our little flag has gone away, which is good. Now if I log in,
and we do IPA, we should have, we're actually not getting an IP yet, so let's see, maybe we're not serving the scope. Let's check that. Oops, this guy here. Let's go back to DHCP and double check that our scope is on. Yep, that's the problem. Our scope's not on. See that? We got to make sure we've got it authorized. So let's hit authorize. And then here we'll hit refresh. Okay, now we're serving our scope. So basically, I think when I modified the scope, it deauthorized it. So your scope has to stay authorized. Otherwise, it's a security thing in Windows. You have to quote unquote authorize the scope. So if the scope changes, you got to come back up here to your IPv4, and you've got to click authorize. I think it's that one. Nope, it's this. You got to click on the actual server itself and authorize it again. So now if I come back over to this guy and I do this DHCP client, I should be able to look. And yes, I'm getting an IP, and it is the first DHCP one there is. Actually, it's assigned 2 IPs, weirdly, but that's fine. It won't hurt anything. Because Linux servers systems can actually have as many IPs as you want them to have. It's fine. Yeah. So we can actually let's come here. Okay, there it goes. I was going to say we can actually disable the IPv6 if we wanted to, but I'm going to leave it out active. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of our thing here. Okay, so now we should have Active Directory users and computers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a new user in here. So we're just going to create a new user. We're going to call him Joe. Hello, Joe at example.local. Next, we're going to uncheck user must change and password never expires because this is just a test setup. We're going to go ahead and reuse our old password, which is not what we should be doing. So password space shift 1 2 3 4, and then passwd shift space shift 1 2 3 4. Now we have our password configured. We're good and good. Alrighty. So at this point, we're probably good. Let's double check our DNS though, because I think our DNS is probably not correct because I don't think we set that up yet. We can probably also go ahead and get rid of this flag by telling this thing whatever. That's fine. There. Okay. Now let's go back into our DNS and let's see if we've got some records in here. So we should see an example.local, and there's our record for that. We don't see a record for our other system yet, and as you can see, we don't have a reverse lookup zone. So let's go ahead and create a reverse lookup zone. So we'll do new zone. Next, we'll create a primary zone, and we'll do that is fine. That's fine. The network ID is going to be 192.168.101. And as you can see, it'll make it look like this basically as the reverse lookup zone name. So what we're going to do is just hit next here. We're going to allow secure dynamic updates is fine, and we're going to finish that, and that's going to create our reverse lookup name. Now that's going to be really important because without that we're going to have issues. Let's go take a look at our DHCP system again, and let's double check the settings on the DHCP system to make sure we're actually good here. So let's go properties, DNS. It may be that we need to bullet this always dynamically update DNS records instead of only if requested by DHCP clients. So let me check if we release and renew our IP, if we'll get a DNS record, and if we don't, I'll uncheck the other. And then, okay, you see it forgot the IP. Good. Okay, now we'll have it get an IP. And you can see we've got one, which is 11. Now let's check our DNS and see if we've got a dynamically updated DNS system yet. Okay, so refresh and we're good. So you can see our client record is there, and we have our reverse lookup right here. And that's what's important. So in this case, we have our 192.168.101.1.1 pointing to test router client dot. Dot at the end is important, so if you manually add these records, make sure you put that dot there. I think it's pretty hard to miss on a Windows server, but anyway. And then you also need the test router tag client, which is the system's host name, and then you have the IP address for the system here. And then, so now what we're going to do is we're just going to hop back over to our client here. And if we do a, well, you can see the host name is actually in this system right here at the top. And if I do an IPA, you can see the IP matches that INET 192.168.101.11/24 there matches what I put into the domain. So now we are basically good to go and ready to join this thing. The first thing we're going to do though is first we're going to try pinging 8.8.8.8. See what we get. We should get out, and that is thanks to our DHCP options. But just to double check and to show you kind of what's going on and why things work out of the box right there, you can go to not server options but scope, and then scope options, and in here you can see we've got a router and DNS configured. So router points to the router IP, and DNS servers point to the DNS IP, or the IP address for the DNS server. Also note that I set up a forwarder in my DNS server so that it will forward out to the external world. You can right click on it and you can go to properties, and then if you click on forwarders, in there you can add a forwarder. I won't actually show you that because that is an actual network proprietary thing for me, because it uses an IP on my real network. But in this case, that's what you would do. You just go in there, you'd add an IP to that list, and it will say basically if the record is not on this DNS server, it will query the next one in the chain. In this case, it's querying my real DNS server, which actually exists on my real network and is in fact a bind 9 server. So really that's doing all the work beyond this actual network, and this DNS server is literally just to serve the purposes of this internal local static network, or isolated network really, that we're using for our example here. So now that we have all this configured, we are in fact ready to go. You can see those DNS servers, that DHCP stuff pushed down. So if I look at IP route, you'll see here that the default is via 192.168.101.133, which is my router. And if I come over here and I do cat etc resolve.conf, you can see here that my name server is 192.168.101.10. All right, so let's get on with the show here. So if we do, first of all, I want to configure sudo. So apt install sudo. That's a good idea to have sudo access on your system setup, even if you have this thing. The other thing, even if you have su set up so that you can just log in as root, basically. So basically, if you set a root password on the system, you can just su to root. It's a good idea to have sudo enabled if you're doing a domain, because it allows you to basically create domain admins that can then log in with sudo privileges right off the cuff. So basically, an administrator would be equivalent to an administrator on Windows. Basically, it would behave like you would expect it to behave, which is kind of nice. And I'll show you guys how to set that up towards the end of the video. So basically what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and grab some dependencies and the actual list of packages. Now note that this is being done in a terminal, and for the most part you do need to do these commands in a terminal. I'm not necessarily aware of any GUI programs, at least on KDE, that set this up easily, but maybe there are some in other desktop environments such as GNOME. I know RHEL, I think, has an easy, quick way to join domains too, I think. Also, there are other options beyond what I'm going to use here to join domains, like authconfig, and also you can do LDAP, just simple LDAP binds and queries and stuff like that if you want to query it directly instead of doing a full bind to a domain and basically joining, quote unquote, joining the domain, which is different than binding to it and then querying it for stuff. So basically what we're going to be using is a program called realmd. So we're going to install sudo, or just apt install realm, or EALMD. We're also going to get NTP, which configuring and setting up NTP is a little outside of the scope of this video. I don't want to kind of linger on too much here, but just note that it's going to be very important for you to configure NTP over the long term, because the domain skews tolerance is time skew tolerance is about 5 minutes, I think, by default. So basically what that means is that if your time is too far off, you may not be able to authenticate. So just bear that in mind, that you may want to set up and configure an NTP server. Hopefully that's not too hard to Google. It's pretty easy to do. I actually set mine up as a Linux system, but you can do it on Windows or whatever. So ADCLI, SSSD, TAC tools, policy, TAC kit, or not TAC kit, sorry, kit, TAC1, and then package kit. That's what you want to install, basically. So you do those things, you're going to hit yes, and it's going to go out and grab all the good stuff. And you should see it install, and it should be fairly quick. So let me go through while that's installing rather than stopping the video. I'll talk about why you need these various packages. So realmd is actually going to be sort of like an auto configuration tool. It's what's actually going to be responsible for configuring the fact that you're joined to this domain. And it's going to use something called SSSD as the primary authentication mechanism. Now that mechanism is going to integrate with your PAM daemon, so your pluggable authentication module daemon and system. So basically it's going to integrate directly with your standard Linux system, which is very, very good. And it's going to do that automatically. You won't have to do any manual configuration of any of this, really. Although there is going to be some configuration that I'll show you where you can enhance your installation a little bit, but you will be able to get a real bind and join to the domain just from simply doing this installation and then a handful of commands. If your domain is properly configured as I've showed you, and you have basically DNS records in there, it's really not that bad to be able to join, but you know, there is some mild consideration, especially if you don't have records set up in your DNS and all that. But then again, if that's not configured properly, Windows systems aren't going to be able to join really either, so just bear that in mind. One thing to note is that if you don't install policy kit TAC1, you may get a not authorized error when you enter the realm discover command. And also note, if you don't install the package kit, you'll get an error when you try to join the domain that will tell you that you're missing packages, but it may not explicitly point out that that's the package that you need. That took a lot of troubleshooting for me to figure out that that was missing on a system. That information may actually be a touch dated. I'm not really 100% sure on that, because when I first started doing this was like several Debian versions before, and I've just kind of always done it that way since, because it's the way that worked for me. So that's kind of the way I'm going to show you, because it doesn't seem to cause any problems and it seems to work okay. And yeah, so it's a pretty nice way of doing it. And in the end of this, we're going to have a nice system that will effectively be a first-class citizen on a Windows domain. So effectively, you'll be able to do things like change your password from the command line using the standard PASSWD setting. You'll have home directories that get automatically created when a user first logs in, even if they're a domain user. You'll have users can effectively log in immediately upon doing this. You'll be able to see Linux from Linux user groups from Active Directory, and you'll be able to respect those groups too. So you can effectively say domain admins, for instance, can have sudo privileges on systems. Yeah, so it's a very, very cool way of doing it, I think. All right, so now that we've got our realmd installed, you can see it doesn't take very long to do, but you know, it's a little sluggish. It depends, but it's not too bad overall. Now we can go ahead and begin configuring things. Originally, I noted that AppArmor might cause problems with your domain join. I don't think that's necessarily true anymore. I think AppArmor works pretty well with it. But if you do have problems, you may want to install AppArmor utils or AppArmor tools. AppArmor tools is if you are on Buster or below, and AppArmor utils is if you are on Debian testing, which at current time is Bullseye or above. And you'll need to do sudo AA tac disable SSSD to disable the SSSD jailing in AppArmor if you wish to do such a thing. So if you run into problems, that's a thing you could try. Just so that you can see what it is, I'll type the command in here. tac disable. So you would run that command basically after installing the package tools in the case of Debian Buster, and in Bullseye or above it would be utils. But for me, I'm going to go ahead and leave that off because I'm pretty sure that's not necessary anymore. I'm pretty sure they fixed whatever bug was causing that. So now we're just going to do realm. Actually, yeah, we can do that. Realm discover. And we're going to do example.local. And we should get some information about our realm. Oh. Am I right about that? I should be right about that. Oh, I misspelled. That's it. D-I-S-C-O-V-E-R. Misspelled discover. Okay, so now we should get some information about our realm, which you can see we do. And you can see here it's got some suggested packages that we should install as required packages. So yeah, just as a little side note here, basically I discovered upon finishing the recording of this video that a certain package was not installed. So that's the Samba common bin. So I think the other packages may have gotten pulled in as a dependency of SSSD, but Samba common bin was not one that I told you to install before. So before we go ahead and join our domain, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that. So if you do sudo apt install Samba common bin, you should get this. It's going to ask you this question. If you're using Wins, answer yes. If you're not using Wins, like I am in this case, answer no. What this package is basically going to do is it's going to install Samba stuff, and Samba stuff is generally useful for doing things like shared printers, shared network drives, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, you can install that package and then play with that stuff if you'd like. But the actual intricacies of how to do all that's a little bit beyond the scope of the video, so I'll leave you to Googling that one if you want, or maybe I'll do a demonstration video specifically focusing on how to do shared printers and network drives, like if you were, for instance, going to create maybe a network file server and you wanted to share in such a way that the shares behaved more like what you're used to with Windows shares, so that you could then maybe mount those shares natively like a Windows server would. Like say if you had a Windows client and you wanted to mount shares from a Linux server, but you wanted them to behave like a normal Windows share, you could do that using Samba. We're going to go ahead and run through with our join. So let's do realm join, and then we're going to do tac user. So tac user equals, and in my case it's Joe because that's the one I configured. And then we're going to type the name of the realm we're going to join, which is going to be example.local. And then that is that. And now we're just going to give it the password, which was passwd space 1234 with shift key down. And we have insufficient permissions to join the domain, and that is because we did not make our guy an admin of the domain. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we come in here and we go add direct users, and we come down here and we find our Joe Blow account, we're going to go over here to account. Oh, I'm sorry, not account. We're going to go member of, and we're going to come in here and we're going to add domain admin. We should get this domain admins. And you can even set that primary if you want. It's not necessary, I don't think. He just needs to be a member, but I like setting it primary when I do that. And then if I re-enter this and then give it the systemurd space 1234, now we should get a proper join. Now again, if you don't have your reverse lookup record configured correctly, you may get an error there that says very much the same thing. Couldn't join realm, insufficient permissions to join the domain. If you see that error and you know you're a domain admin, then probably you have a DNS problem and you need to check to see if you've got a reverse and forward lookup record in your DNS system. Okay, so now that we've established that, we can probably do sudo system, or actually let's just do vi etsy sssd ssd.conf, Now let's take a look at this file. So this file has been configured for us. You can see we've got example.local, example.local, example.local in here. We've got realmd tags. There's some stuff we really don't want to mess with. One thing I like to do is I like to clone this, and then I like to do, oh goodness. All right, hold on one second. Let's go ahead and do this first. Install vim, and get a much less irritating interface to work with. Much prefer vim over vi. And in your case, if you're new to Linux, you can use nano instead. It's a much simpler text editor. But in my case, I prefer vim. And Debian actually does this neat thing that when you install vim, it basically fully replaces vi, so you can just use the vi command, which is pretty cool. And we're going to do sssd again and sssd.conf. Now note, if you do sudo there, you're going to need to manually type this out. You're not going to be able to tab complete it because you're not going to have permissions to read beyond the sssd directory. You will be able to open the file, but you'll need to know its name. The only way to be able to tab complete is to su to root or do sudo tac I to become root. And the reason that is because your normal user cannot see inside the sssd directory. So just realize that's the case. That's what's going on. Okay, so now that we've got this, let's go ahead and clone this guy. And what we'll do is we'll do overwrite. It's not overwrite, it's override. So let's go here and do RIDE like that. Okay, so we want that guy. And another thing we can do is we can change use fully qualified domain names. So by default, it's going to be fully qualified domain names, which means I would need to do login as username at domain name.local. So in my case, it would be joe at example.local. You can, in fact, log in simply as Joe if you turn this into false, okay? And that will make it so you can just log in as Joe. Now, the downside to this is if you have a local user that also uses the name Joe, it'll create some sort of conflict. So you can still log in, and you can still even use fully qualified domain name to log in, but be aware that switching this to local or to non-fully qualified domain names may cause issues. What I personally like to do is I like to create only domain accounts on my systems and never use local accounts. And for the record, for those of you who are wondering, by the way, an old practice way back in the day, and actually kind of a myth, by the way, was that in order to join a Linux system to a Windows domain, you had issues with like laptops, for instance, when you would take them off network. So like if I had a laptop on a domain, I join the domain, I can log in while I'm on the domain, but as soon as I leave my house and take my laptop somewhere else, I'm not going to be able to log into the laptop on my domain profile anymore. So people would create local profiles in addition to domain profiles. That is completely not necessary. SSSD does support credential caching just like a normal Windows system does. You do not need some weird tricky dick local account or anything like that. Just set this up the way I'm showing you. You'll be able to take your laptop with you and log into it with it, regardless of whether or not you're attached to the domain 24/7. Basically, the requirement is that you join the domain and that you log into the system with a user at least once before leaving the network. And then that user will be able to continue to log in while the system is off network and due to cached credentials. Now, if you clear the cache credentials, obviously that's going to be a problem and prevent that user from logging in. But generally speaking, they should be fine as long as you've logged in at least once. I've logged in and gone on vacation before for a full week and been able to access my system just fine. So not really an issue. Clearing the credential cache basically is a manual process, generally speaking, so you shouldn't have any issue with it. Another thing to note is this is your home directory. So yes, this will create home directories for your user, and this is specifying which kind of home directory it's going to actually create. So in this case, the %u is the username, the %d is the domain name, and the @ is the literal @ symbol. So effectively, you're going to have a home folder that is /home/joe at example.local in this case. Now, that may be important to leave that alone like that because if you had a local user on the system called Joe, that may conflict if you set it to just be %u and just create local users with just local user home folders, or that look like local user home folders anyway. But if you wanted to do that, you would just back this %d off of there. But I'm going to leave mine on because I prefer to have the domain name on the home folder. Okay, so the last thing you might want to do is I have noticed that if you're running on Debian testing or better, so at the time of this recording is Debian Bullseye, you're going to want to add one more directive in here, otherwise you're going to run into problems potentially with authentication. So what you can do is you can do AD_GPO_access_control equals PERMISSIVE permissive. Okay. As long as you have that in there, you'll be good to go if you're on testing or higher. And one other thing I should point out is in here, if you're using ZSH, you can set up a default shell. You can also, I think, configure default shells in your actual Active Directory system in order to say this particular user uses ZSH or whatever one. Just be careful that whatever default shell you have on there or in that defined in there is one that actually exists on the system, which by default is bin bash. So that's probably wise to leave that bin bash unless you know you're going to be configuring all your systems to use ZSH, as I have done. Because basically if you join the domain and that shell doesn't exist, your user is not going to be able to log in. So yeah, so do that, and then we're going to do sudo, or actually we don't even need sudo in this case, but you can use it if you've been using sudo this whole time, you can use sudo, but we're just going to do system ctl restart sssd. That's going to restart the SSSD system. And now if I type the ID command and I type Joe, you can see here that it gets my user ID and my GID, which you'll note my GID happens to be domain admins, as you might see from the domain controller. And the GIDs are actually really, really big. If these were local users, the GIDs would be or the GID and the UID would actually be lower numbers, like 100 or 1,000. It'd be 1,000, 1,001, 1,002. Because these are domain accounts, they have really, really big UIDs and GIDs such that they do not clash or conflict with local user GIDs and UIDs. So you'll note that these accounts all have domain privileges, and they're fine that way. So now the other thing we can do to get sudo privileges to work for our domain user is we can go into etc, and then we can go into sudoers.d. And in here we're just going to make a file. So sudo, or actually just vi, and we're going to call this domain underscore admins. There we go. And in here we're going to put %, because groups always exist with a %. We're going to do domain \space admins or admins, like that, at example.local all equals all. Okay, and that's that. So now, let's try this. Let's log out. Okay, we're going to log in as Joe, and we're going to use our password, PASSWORD, space 1234, enter, and there we go. Okay, so now you can see I'm logged in as Joe at test router TAC client, and it looks like it didn't actually create a home directory for me, so let's check out why that is. So we do need to edit something in PAM for that. So we should be able to sudo up this. Let's do sudo TAC I PASSWORD shift 4. There we go. I know why. Okay, let's exit back out. Okay, and we'll log back in as root. We'll do vi etc sudoers.d domain admins. Okay, basically the reason this isn't working is because I have fully qualified domain names off. So if you have fully qualified domain names off, you're going to want that. Really, what you could do even is you could do both. So have one that has fully qualified and have one that does not have fully qualified, like this. And what that's going to do, so when you have fully qualified turned off, basically what that means is that you can't use the group with it fully qualified like that. So the other thing we're going to do is we're going to do sudo vi etc and then pamd common session. Okay, so in here we're just going to add a line basically. So it can be right here at the end, and we're just going to do session required pam underscore mk home dir.so and then skel equals etc skel, and then mask equals 0022. Done deal, done deal. Okay, so basically what that's saying is during the login, you're going to do this option. That's what session required is. We're going to run the pam make home dir.so plugin, and we're going to set the the skel file to etc skel. Etc skel is basically the skeleton file so that you can configure default stuff to go in people's home directories if you like, and the umask is their default permissions to their actual folder. So 22 0022 like that basically means that they'll have full permission to their own directories, and I think read and read. So if you want, you can do 0027 if you want full permissions. Full permissions, read-only permissions for group, and then no permissions for everyone. That is a security thing. So if you want your UMask to be a little bit more secure so that everybody can't look at your stuff, you would want a 7 there. The way a UMask works technically is it's like the opposite of regular permissions, so you have to think in reverse a little bit because it's a mask. So basically you can think of it as you're assigning the permissions you don't want the users to have, or those particular objects to have, really. Okay, so we can do that too. That's perfectly fine. So now if we log out, we can do exit, and we can log in as Joe again, and then we can do passwd space 1234, enter. That should get us in. And now you can see we've created our home directory. So if we look at our home directory, that's ls/home. You can see we have joe@example.local, and if I look pwd, I'm in joe@example.local, and if I ls-al, you can see that I own the things in my home directory. So there's one other thing I wanted to talk to you guys about, and that is if you are running a graphical user interface and you join your system to the domain, you need to be careful and make sure that the login desktop login system that you have in place works well with it. Basically, you need to make sure that it supports typable names, or that it can list user IDs with very high numbers attached to them. So most managers will list within a simple range of 1,000 to, I don't know, like 9,000 or something like that. I don't remember the exact top end, but basically it generally lists a very short range of UIDs because it's designed to cut out system UIDs and all that other stuff. So if yours does not list them, then you may not be able to log in easily. And if that is the case, you may need to switch themes or switch login managers. Most of them, from what I understand, will support typable usernames. However, older versions of KDE, not all that long ago actually, and prior versions of Debian even, had a hard time with the default themes, or if you themed it differently, maybe you may have a theme that doesn't support the typable user IDs. And if you have that, you may have a hard time logging in with your domain profiles. So just be careful with that and make sure that whatever theme or decoration you have for your login system supports typable usernames, because if it does not, again, you're going to have issues. So that's just one word of warning. You'll have to basically Google your own if you can't figure it out, because there's just too many of them for me to cover. I do know that the default in Debian now, with current versions of Debian, Debian 10, Debian 11, etc., KDE works just fine out of the box with UIDs, or with domain users, or at least it appears to. It seems to be fine. I generally don't have to do a whole lot to configure it. So I just wanted to put that last little note in there for everybody who might be who might run into that issue. Okay, so that was a demonstration of how to configure Windows DNS, DHCP, and Active Directory, and how to join a Linux system to said computer. I hope you've enjoyed this little tutorial, and I hope it taught you guys a lot. Thank you for watching. See you next time.